The water off the coast of Kyushu smelled of oil and rust on the morning of April 6, 1945, and Petty Officer 2nd Class Katsukichi Mori could taste iron at the back of his throat as he stood on the main deck of the largest battleship ever constructed and watched the horizon absorb the last of Japan. The Yamato had cleared the Bungo Strait at dusk the previous evening, passed the final coastal markers, and entered open water with 278,000 tons of fuel in her tanks, enough for a one-way crossing and nothing more. The Imperial Japanese Navy had done the arithmetic precisely. There was no fuel allocated for a return voyage because the men who planned this operation had not considered a return voyage worth calculating. Admiral Seiichi Ito had received his orders 6 days earlier in a briefing room at the Combined Fleet headquarters. The orders were not ambiguous. Yamato would sail to Okinawa, where American forces had been landing in force since April 1st. She would beach herself on the shallows off the coast, anchor her hull in the sand, and become a fixed coastal battery, fighting until her ammunition was gone, or until American air power ended the matter in the way that American air power had been ending most matters in the Pacific for the better part of 2 years. Ito had listened to the orders in silence. Then he had asked whether there was any air cover planned for the transit. He was told there would be a partial fighter escort for the initial leg of the journey. He asked what partial meant. The number he received in reply was somewhere between inadequate and none. He approved the mission anyway, because the alternative was to let the ship sit in harbour until American bombers found her there, which everyone understood was not an alternative at all, but simply a different method of arriving at the same destination. Aboard the ship that morning, some of the crew knew and some did not. The ones who knew had made their peace in the particular way that young men make their peace with things that cannot be changed, quietly, quickly, and without the ceremony that the moment probably deserved. A gun crew on the aft turret had spent part of the previous evening writing names on pieces of paper and folding them into their uniform pockets. An engineering officer had eaten 3 full bowls of rice at dinner, more than his usual portion, for reasons he did not explain to anyone sitting near him. The ship herself was doing what she had always done, which was to move through the ocean with the slow and total authority of something that had never been successfully argued with. She displaced 72,800 tons at full load. Her main battery threw shells that weighed 1,460 kilograms. She had been built to be unsinkable by anything her designers could imagine in 1937. What her designers had not adequately imagined was already forming up on the flight decks of carrier task groups to the south, nearly 400 aircraft, their engines warming in the grey morning, their pilots studying target diagrams of a ship they had never seen at close range and would never need to see again. The question that none of the men on either side could yet answer, standing in that particular morning on that particular stretch of the Pacific, was how long it would take. Part 1. The gun that was supposed to win the Pacific, the Yamato, was not an accident. She was a theory. To understand the theory, you have to understand the position Japan found itself in during the 1920s and 1930s, specifically its position relative to the United States Navy. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had imposed strict tonnage limits on the capital ships of the major naval powers. The United States was permitted a total tonnage of 525,000 tons in capital ships. Britain received the same allocation. Japan received 315,000 tons, a ratio of roughly 5 to 5 to 3, which the Japanese naval establishment regarded, with considerable justification, as a diplomatic instrument designed to permanently subordinate Japanese sea power to Anglo-American dominance. The logic of the treaty was simple. If Japan could never build as many battleships as the Americans, Japan could never win a direct exchange of attrition in the Pacific. The Americans had more ships, more steel, more oil, more industrial capacity. A war of quantity would always favor Washington over Tokyo. The Japanese Naval General Staff's answer to this problem was elegant in its conception and catastrophically wrong in its execution. If Japan could not win a war of quantity, it would prepare to win a war of quality. Specifically, Japan would build a small number of ships so individually powerful that they could destroy American battleships from a range at which American guns could not effectively reply. The Americans would close the range as doctrine demanded. The Japanese ships would destroy them before they got there. This was the Kantai-Kessen doctrine, the doctrine of the decisive battle. The concept held that the Pacific War would be decided in a single climactic fleet engagement, a Tsushima for the 20th century, in which Japanese gunnery superiority would annihilate the American battle line before it could be brought to bear. The Yamato and her sister ship Musashi were the physical embodiment of this doctrine. They were designed to fight at ranges of 35 to 40 kilometers, distances at which their 460mm shells could reach targets that could not effectively shoot back with their own guns of smaller caliber. The designers at the Kure Naval Arsenal produced a ship that was, by the standards of what a battleship could be, close to the theoretical maximum. The Yamato's main battery of 9 460mm guns in 3 triple turrets could fire shells weighing 1,460 kilograms to a maximum range of approximately 42 kilometers. Her armor belt at the waterline was 410 millimeters thick. Her deck armor over the magazines reached 230 millimeters. She had been designed to survive hits from any gun then in service with any navy in the world. She was laid down at Kure Naval Arsenal on November 4, 1937. Launched on August 8, 1940, commissioned on December 16, 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor. Hold that date. The Yamato entered service 9 days after the attack that brought America into the war. The attack, incidentally, that was launched not by battleships, but by aircraft. Carrier-based aircraft that flew 370 kilometers from their launch point and sank or damaged 18 American warships without a single Japanese ship coming within gun range of Pearl Harbor. The decisive battle doctrine assumed that the decisive instrument of naval warfare was the gun. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated, to anyone paying attention, that the decisive instrument was now the aircraft. These two facts existed simultaneously in the Japanese strategic consciousness from the first days of the Pacific War, and the tension between them was never resolved. The Yamato was the product of one set of assumptions. The war she fought was governed by a completely different set. The Japanese had, in fact, demonstrated this themselves. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood the shift. The carrier admirals who executed it understood it. But the Naval General Staff had spent 15 years and extraordinary resources building a doctrine and a fleet around the decisive battle concept, and institutions do not easily abandon 15 years of investment. The Yamato was commissioned, she was deployed, and she spent most of the first 3 years of the Pacific War doing almost nothing, too valuable to risk, too doctrine-bound to use effectively. Meet Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito. 54 years old at the time of the Yamato's final mission, a career naval officer who had served in staff positions throughout the 1930s, including stints in the Naval Affairs Bureau and as a senior operations officer. Ito was appointed commander of the Second Fleet, the force built around the Yamato, in late 1944. He was, by all accounts, a competent and professionally serious officer who understood the situation with considerable clarity. When Ito was briefed on Operation Tengo, the plan to send the Yamato on her one-way mission to Okinawa, his response was documented. He asked, according to the accounts of officers present at the briefing, whether the operation had any realistic prospect of success. He was told, in effect, that the prospect was not the point. The point was the gesture. The point was that the Imperial Navy could not allow the Army and the air units to sacrifice themselves at Okinawa while the surface fleets sat in harbour. The Navy's honour required that the Yamato sail. Ito accepted this. He flew his flag aboard her. There is something worth pausing over in that exchange. Ito was not a fool. He knew what American carrier air power had done to Japanese naval forces throughout 1943 and 44. He had watched the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, the engagement American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which Japanese carrier aviation was effectively destroyed as a coherent force. 3 Japanese carriers sunk, 650 aircraft lost in 2 days, against American losses of 123 aircraft. He knew what the numbers meant. He sailed anyway, because the institution required it. That is the first thing to understand about the Yamato's last voyage. It was not a military decision, it was an institutional one. And the men aboard paid for it with their lives. Part 2. The world the Yamato was built for and the world that had replaced it. By April of 1945, the Pacific War had been running for 3 years and 4 months. The trajectory of that war is worth laying out in cold numbers, because the cold numbers tell you everything about why the Yamato's mission was what it was. In December of 1941, Japan had 10 fleet carriers. The United States had 3 operational in the Pacific. By the end of 1942, Coral Sea, Midway, the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign, Japan had lost 4 of those fleet carriers and the United States had lost 2. But American shipyards were already producing replacements at a rate Japan could not match. The Essex-class carrier program, authorized before Pearl Harbor, was delivering new fleet carriers at a pace of roughly 1 every 2 months by 1943 and 1944. Japan built 5 fleet carriers during the entire Pacific War. The United States commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers between 1943 and 1945. 17 against 5. Stop and think about what that ratio means in a war where the carrier is the decisive instrument. By April of 1945, the American carrier forces operating in the waters around Okinawa included Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Task Force 58 comprised 4 carrier groups with a total of 11 fleet carriers and 5 light carriers. Those carriers embarked approximately 1,000 aircraft. Against this force, the Yamato would be accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, a force with no air cover whatsoever because Japan had no carrier-based aviation left to provide it. Meet Lieutenant Commander Mitsuru Yoshida, 25 years old, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima. Yoshida served as a junior officer aboard the Yamato during her final voyage, and he survived. His memoir, written after the war, is one of the primary sources for what happened aboard the ship during those last hours. He described the atmosphere during the departure from the inland sea as one of determined fatalism. Officers and men who understood they were not coming back and had made their peace with it in whatever way each man could. Yoshida wrote of men cleaning their quarters, of officers burning personal letters, of a silence in the passageways that was different from normal sea silence. He described the Yamato's captain, Rear Admiral Kosaku Aruga, addressing the crew and telling them that they were sailing on a mission from which return was not expected, and that they should consider themselves already dead. The traditional formulation of the samurai ethos applied to a crew of 2,747 men aboard a ship that would never see its home port again. Consider what that briefing required of the men in that formation, not the officers who had spent careers inside an institution that had conditioned them toward this kind of sacrifice, the ordinary enlisted men. 19-year-olds from fishing villages in Kyushu, 20-year-olds who had joined the Navy because the Navy was Japan's pride. They stood in formation and were told they were already dead, and then they went below to their stations and the ship got underway. The Yamato transited the Bungo Strait, the channel between Kyushu and Shikoku, on the night of April 6th. American submarines detected her almost immediately. The submarine USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback tracked the Japanese force as it cleared the strait and transmitted contact reports to Task Force 58. By the early hours of April 7th, Mitcher knew the Yamato was at sea, knew her course, and knew she was heading for Okinawa. Here is the key detail. The Yamato's mission plan called for her to reach the waters off Okinawa on the morning of April 8th, beach herself on the western coast of the island, and use her main battery to bombard American landing forces. Her anti-aircraft battery, which was substantial, comprising 152 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers added during successive refits, was supposed to make her difficult to attack from the air. Her armor was supposed to absorb whatever the aircraft could deliver. The planners had looked at what American aircraft bombs and torpedoes could do to a ship of the Yamato's protection scheme, and they had calculated that she could absorb the ordnance. They were wrong. But they were not wrong in a simple way. They were wrong because they had been working from data about attacks by smaller strike packages against less concentrated targets. They had not modelled what happened when you sent a ship with no air cover into waters where the opposing side had 1,000 aircraft, and the time to plan a coordinated, sequential, concentrated attack. The Americans had that time. They used it. Vice Admiral Mitchell received the contact reports before dawn on April 7th. He had several hours before his aircraft could reach the Yamato's position. He used those hours to plan an attack that was not a strike. It was a systematic dismantling. The attack was structured to hit the Yamato from multiple directions simultaneously, to saturate her anti-aircraft defenses by requiring them to engage threats coming from different bearings at the same time, and to concentrate torpedoes on her port side to exploit the known asymmetry in Japanese damage control capacity. That last point matters. The Yamato's designers had built her with damage control systems that were sophisticated by the standards of her construction period. But she had one structural vulnerability that the American planners knew about or deduced. If she took sufficient flooding on one side, she would develop a list that could become self-reinforcing. Counter-flooding on the opposite side could correct this, but counter-flooding reduced buoyancy. If the flooding was severe enough and fast enough, the counter-flooding would not save her. It would only change the rate at which she went down. The American attack plan targeted the port side. This was not luck, this was intelligence, planning, and the product of 3 years of hard-won experience in what it took to sink large warships in the Pacific. Part 3. 2 hours and 1 minute. At 12:22 in the afternoon of April 7, 1945, the first wave of American aircraft reached the Yamato's position. She was approximately 200 kilometers southwest of Kyushu in the East China Sea, making 22 knots through moderate seas under an overcast sky. The first wave consisted of aircraft from the carriers Bennington, Essex, Bunker Hill, and Hornet. There were approximately 280 aircraft in the total attack force that had been launched from Task Force 58 that morning. They came in waves, timed to overlap the recovery and reload cycles of the Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries. The Yamato opened fire with everything she had, 152 anti-aircraft guns. Her main battery fired Sanshiki-dan, beehive shells, each one packed with incendiary sub-projectiles, designed to create a wall of fragmentation and fire in the path of attacking aircraft. The noise and visual spectacle of the Yamato firing her main battery in anti-aircraft mode was, by all accounts, extraordinary. The concussion of those 460mm guns firing at low elevation sent shock waves across the water that could be felt by pilots in aircraft hundreds of meters away. It did not matter. The first torpedo hit the Yamato at 12:41, 19 minutes after the attack began. Then a second. Then a bomb hit amidships. The sequence of what followed is documented from both the survivor accounts of the 249 men who were eventually pulled from the water and from the strike reports filed by American aviators after they returned to their carriers. Within the first 30 minutes of the attack, the Yamato had taken at least 4 torpedo hits, all on the port side, and 2 bomb hits. She was developing a list to port. Her damage control teams were working the counter-flooding systems, but the flooding was coming in faster than the pumps could manage. Her speed dropped from 22 knots to 18, then to 12, then to 8. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida was in the ship's operations center during the attack. He described the interior of the Yamato during the assault as a place of controlled chaos. Men at their stations, officers issuing orders, the ship's internal communications still functioning, the lights still on. And then a torpedo hit directly below the operations center, and the lights went out, and the list became severe enough that men were having difficulty standing on the deck. He wrote of the sound. Not the sound of the explosions, he described those as almost abstract by that point, too many and too close together to process individually. But the sound of the ship, the sound of a 63,000-ton structure beginning to fail, the groan of steel under asymmetric stress, the movement of water in compartments where water had no business being. The Yamato's captain, Rear Admiral Aruga, ordered counter-flooding of the starboard engine rooms at approximately 1:20 in the afternoon. The counter-flooding reduced the list from about 15 degrees back to approximately 5 degrees, but it flooded the starboard engine rooms and reduced the ship's speed further, and the attack was still coming. The second wave of American aircraft arrived as the counter-flooding was being executed. They found a ship that was already wounded, already slow, already listing, and they hit her again. More torpedoes on the port side. The list came back, faster this time, 10 degrees, 15, 20. At 1:17 in the afternoon, the Yamato's list reached approximately 35 degrees to port. At this angle, the lower gun turrets were submerged. The upper deck was approaching the waterline on the port side. Men were sliding. Men were falling. Vice Admiral Ito, the fleet commander, was on the bridge. He had watched his force, the Yamato, the cruiser Yahagi, the 8 destroyers, take punishment for nearly an hour. The Yahagi had already been sunk. 3 of the destroyers were sunk or sinking. The remaining destroyers were attempting to rescue survivors from the water while themselves under attack. Ito ordered the surviving destroyers to rescue survivors. Then, according to the accounts of officers who were present, he went to his sea cabin adjacent to the bridge, closed the door, and did not come out again. He went down with the ship, by choice. At 1:23 in the afternoon, 2 hours and 1 minute after the first American aircraft arrived over the Yamato's position, the ship's list reached approximately 90 degrees. She was on her side. And then one of her forward magazines detonated. The explosion was visible from the Japanese coast. Sailors aboard American ships 60 kilometers away saw the column of smoke. The cloud rose to approximately 6,000 meters, nearly 20,000 feet, and hung in the sky for minutes after the ship was gone. The Yamato sank in 3,350 meters of water. She took 2,498 men down with her. 249 survived. The entire attack, from first contact to the magazine explosion, had lasted 2 hours and 1 minute. The American aircraft losses in the operation were 10 aircraft and 12 aviators, a cost that, in the brutal arithmetic of Pacific air-sea warfare, was considered acceptable. If this investigation is giving you something you couldn't get from the standard accounts, not the version that survived in official communiques, but the version that the survivors wrote down when they were still trying to understand what had happened to them, press the like button. It keeps this story visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The Yamato did not sink because American pilots were lucky, or because Japanese damage control was incompetent, or because the ship had some fatal design flaw that her builders had overlooked. The Yamato sank because she was the product of a doctrine that had been rendered obsolete by a technology her builders understood perfectly well and chose to subordinate to the requirements of institutional continuity and strategic prestige. Work through this carefully. The Japanese Navy that designed and built the Yamato was not ignorant of naval aviation. The same Navy that laid down the Yamato in November of 1937 also operated the carrier Akagi, the carrier Kaga, the carrier Soryu, the carrier Hiryu, the 4 carriers that would strike Pearl Harbor 4 years later. The Japanese carrier force in December of 1941 was arguably the most capable in the world. The pilots were better trained than their American counterparts. The aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0, was superior in several critical performance metrics to anything the Americans were flying from carriers at that moment. The Japanese Navy understood carrier aviation. It had built a world-class carrier force, and simultaneously it had also built the Yamato, because the Naval General Staff could not bring itself to abandon the decisive battle doctrine, could not write off the investment in the Kantai-Kessen concept, could not accept that the weapon system they had spent 15 years optimizing for was no longer the decisive instrument of naval warfare. This is a pattern that appears throughout military history with such regularity that it deserves a name. Call it the prestige weapon trap. An institution invests heavily in money, in doctrine, in institutional identity, in a category of weapon. The weapon is superseded by a new technology. The institution acknowledges the new technology and even adopts it, but cannot bring itself to abandon the old weapon, because the old weapon has become part of the institution's self-image. The result is a force that tries to fight the new war with the old weapon while also fighting with the new technology, and ends up doing neither, as well as a force that made a clean choice. The Americans made a cleaner choice. Not a perfect choice. The US Navy also had its battleship admirals and its institutional inertia, but by the time of the Okinawa campaign, American carrier doctrine had been refined through 3 years of combat into something that worked. Task Force 58 was the product of that refinement. 11 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 1,000 aircraft, a logistics train that could keep that force at sea and operational for months at a time. Against this, Japan sent 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and 8 destroyers, with no air cover. The outcome was not a surprise to anyone who looked at those numbers honestly. And here is the most precise irony of the Yamato's final mission. The Yamato's anti-aircraft battery, 152 guns, represented a genuine effort to adapt the ship to the new reality of air-sea warfare. The successive refits she underwent between 1942 and 1944 had stripped away some of her secondary armament and replaced it with anti-aircraft weapons precisely because her operators understood that aircraft were the threat. They understood it, they added the guns, and then they sent her into a situation where 152 anti-aircraft guns were insufficient to defend against the volume of attack that 280 aircraft from 16 carriers could generate, because no number of guns on a single ship without air cover can defend against that volume of attack. The solution to the anti-aircraft problem was not more anti-aircraft guns on the Yamato. The solution was the combat air patrol, friendly fighters orbiting above the fleet to intercept enemy aircraft before they could reach attack position. Japan had no combat air patrol to offer the Yamato. Japan had no carrier aviation left in any coherent form to provide one. The guns were an answer to the wrong version of the question. Now consider what happened to the men. Vice Admiral Ito, 54 years old. He had spent 35 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had risen to command its most powerful surface force. He had asked, at the briefing for Operation Tengo, whether the operation had any realistic prospect of success. He had been told the question was not the point. He had accepted that answer, flown his flag aboard the Yamato, and when the ship was clearly lost, gone to his sea cabin and closed the door. He was not found among the survivors. His body was not recovered. Rear Admiral Kosaku Aruga, the Yamato's captain. He had told his crew they were already dead before the ship left harbour. When the list became fatal, he ordered the surviving destroyers to rescue survivors and then, according to witness accounts, lashed himself to the compass binnacle on the bridge. He went down with the ship he had commanded. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuru Yoshida survived. He was 25 years old, pulled from the water by a destroyer after spending time in the East China Sea among the wreckage and the dead. He returned to Japan, wrote his memoir, published under the title Requiem for Battleship Yamato, and lived until 1979. He was 59 years old when he died. He spent the decades between the sinking and his death in part trying to account for what he had seen and what it meant that he had lived when 2,498 others had not. The 249 survivors were the ones the destroyers could reach before American aircraft drove the rescue ships away from the area. 2,498 men were in the water or trapped below decks when the ship went down. The water temperature in the East China Sea in April is cold enough to produce hypothermia within hours. Many of the men in the water were wounded. Many were not strong swimmers. The Japanese Navy of 1945 had been conscripting men from agricultural and industrial backgrounds who had little maritime experience. 2,498. The largest warship ever built. The most powerful guns ever put to sea. The armor belt thick enough to stop any naval gun then in service. None of it was relevant to the question of whether 280 aircraft with torpedoes and bombs could sink her. The answer to that question was yes, and it had been yes from the moment the orders were written, and the officers who wrote the orders knew it was yes, and they sent the ship anyway. Go back to that grey morning, April 7, 1945. The Yamato moving through the East China Sea at 22 knots. 2,747 men at their stations. Vice Admiral Ito on the bridge, Rear Admiral Aruga at the compass, Lieutenant Commander Yoshida in the operations center. They knew. Not all of them, not with the same clarity, not with the same ability to articulate what they knew. But they had been told, before the ship left harbour, that they were not expected to return. They had been told the mission's purpose was not military success, but institutional honour. They had been given one-way fuel and pointed at Okinawa. The American pilots who attacked them were doing their jobs, with skill and coordination and the advantage of every system that 3 years of Pacific War experience had built and refined. They were not villains in this story. They were professionals executing a well-planned operation against a target that had been handed to them by an institution that had run out of ideas. The Yamato was the idea. She was the final physical expression of a theory about how naval warfare worked, a theory that had been disproven repeatedly and catastrophically before she ever left harbour for the last time. The Japanese Naval General Staff sent her anyway, because the theory was all they had left, and sending the theory to its death was at least a more dignified ending than admitting it had been wrong. 2,498 men went to the bottom of the East China Sea with the theory. Yoshida wrote, years later, that he thought about the Yamato every day, not about the battle particularly, about the silence in the passageways the night before they sailed, about the men cleaning their quarters, about what it meant that the institution had decided their lives were the appropriate price of its honour. He never found a satisfying answer, neither have I. What I can tell you is this. The Yamato sits in 3,350 meters of water in the East China Sea, broken in two by the magazine explosion, her 460mm guns buried in the silt. She has been there for 80 years. She will be there long after everyone who knew her name as a living thing is gone. The largest battleship ever built, sent on a one-way trip, sunk in 2 hours and 1 minute, not by a better battleship, by a better idea about what war had become. If this investigation gave you something, press the like button, subscribe if you want the next chapter, and remember, the most expensive weapon in the world is worthless if the doctrine behind it stopped being true before the weapon was ever launched.